Hi everyone, my name is Amy Tsou. I work at the National Institutes of Neurological Disorders and Stroke, or the NINDS. And I'm so glad to have the chance to be with you today to talk to you about expanded access in ALS. Now, it's been an exciting time in ALS recently with the approval of some new therapies, but we still have a lot further to go, and the challenge is a really urgent one. So I'm glad to be able to talk to you today about NINDS and expanded access trials in ALS. So just an overview of what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to start off by talking about the Act for ALS legislation, a key development which has provided momentum and important resources for work in this area. And I'll say a few words about how it's been implemented. Then I'm going to talk about a funding opportunity that the NINDS has right now for expanded access trials in ALS that we are excited about. And then I'll say a few words about what the review process would look like for potential applicants and how people with lived experience are involved in that. And finally, I'll talk about some of the unique benefits that we feel that these expanded access trials can offer. And at that point, I think there'll be an opportunity for some questions, and I'll be joined by two of my colleagues, Amelie Gubitz and Emily Caparello, who are part of our NINDS ALS team. So as many of you know, the Access to Critical Therapies for ALS Act, or the Act for ALS, was signed into law by President Biden about 3 years ago now in December of 2021. And Section 2 of that law directed the NIH to set up a program to fund expanded access trials for ALS, and it also provided funding. This law will sunset in September of 2026. So for those who might not be familiar, expanded access, which is also sometimes called compassionate use, is a pathway that essentially provides a way for patients to get access to a therapy before the FDA has approved it and without participating in a clinical trial. And you can see language from the FDA's definition in the yellow box on the slide. So expanded access is a potential pathway for a patient with a serious or immediately life-threatening disease or condition to gain access to an investigational medical product for treatment outside of clinical trials when no comparable or satisfactory alternative therapy options are available. And the link to the FDA page is at the bottom of the slide for those who would like to read more. Now, for a drug to be eligible for expanded access, this requires a sponsor to file what's called an Expanded Access Investigational New Drug, or IND, application. It's perhaps important to say here that the expanded access process is completely regulated by FDA, so the NIH is not involved in this process at all. The other thing it's perhaps important to note here is that actually expanded access was legal before the Act for ALS. But as you can imagine, some of these therapies can be quite expensive. And what Act for ALS provided was a mechanism to pay for some of these therapies by funding expanded access trials in ALS. So in response to Act for ALS, the NINDS created a funding opportunity for these expanded access trials. And that is what I'd like to say more about in the next slide. So this is actually the third year that the NINDS has released a call for applications for people to submit ideas for expanded access trials in ALS. And the link to the full funding announcement is at the bottom of this slide, as well as a link to another webinar that we did where we talked about this funding opportunity. So how can people know if they're eligible to apply? I'd like to go through some of these key criteria, but before I do that, I just do want to note here, these criteria are not set by NIH. These criteria actually come directly from Act for ALS. So the first three criteria have to do with the drug or biological product, the applicant, and the sponsor. So to be eligible, a drug or biological product must have an active either phase 2/3 or phase 3 clinical trial. And as you know, a phase 3 trial, those are the trials which are really trying to answer the question of how well does something work. Secondly, the applicant needs to be one of the clinical sites that's participating in either the phase 2/3 or phase 3 clinical trial. And finally, to be eligible, the sponsor needs to meet criteria as a small business. And those criteria are set by the Small Business Act. So those are some basic criteria that need to be met. There are also some criteria that relate to the study design. So the proposed study, obviously it's a study about expanded access. So the proposed trial needs to show that the providing expanded access to this drug or biological product is going to generate important scientific knowledge about ALS. Now, it's important to say here, this knowledge doesn't necessarily have to be about efficacy. The study could also tell us other types of important information, so things like safety or about long-term side effects. The study also needs to address expanded access for what the FDA calls an intermediate-sized patient population. And the FDA defines this as more than one patient and potentially up to hundreds or even thousands of patients. And finally, the proposed study needs to provide expanded access for patients living with ALS, but only those who are not eligible for any other ongoing clinical trials. So that's clinical trials for the prevention, diagnosis, mitigation, treatment, or cure of ALS. And I think this criteria was really meant to ensure that these expanded access trials don't interfere with any of the other ongoing important trials for ALS. So this funding opportunity has been up since the end of November, and we'll be accepting applications through February 22nd. We're really hoping to receive as many high-quality applications as possible. If you know of anyone who might be eligible, please do send along this information to them. I or another member of our team would be more than happy to meet with them to talk about whether or not they might be eligible. So what happens to an application after it's been submitted? So all applications undergo 2 stages of review, a first level of peer review, and then a second level of review by an advisory council. In the first level of review, the application is assigned to a particular group of independent experts with a range of expertise. And these experts take a look at the application and the proposed study and try to gauge a couple of things. First of all, how important or significant to the field would this study and the knowledge generated by it be? And then secondly, how likely is it that the researchers are actually able to do what they're proposing? And this could take into account a bunch of different factors, including things like whether the people involved have a track record of getting things done, and also how large or ambitious the study that they're proposing is. If an application is reviewed favorably at this stage, then it proceeds to the second level, and the advisory council issues a recommendation for each project on whether or not they recommend it for funding. Now, some of you might be wondering, how are patients or people with lived experience involved? I want to say that the involvement of patients or people with lived experience is very important to us at NINDS. In fact, we specifically state in the funding announcement that we encourage applicants to seek input from people with lived experience very early in the process, even while applicants are thinking about how to design their study, and to seek input from people with lived experience about the goals of the study and how things are measured and whether or not the study is measuring the right things. Also, people with lived experience are part of the panel of experts that provide peer review at the first level of review. So what have we been able to fund so far? I'm really happy to say that we've been able to fund 4 exciting projects. The first project looked at IV trehalose. That was a collaboration between MGH and Selos Therapeutics and was led by Sabrina Paganoni. Last year, we funded 3 additional projects, 2 of which were also collaborations that involved MGH. The first looked at pradapidine and was led by Suma. That project is led by Suma Babu, and I think was discussed on this webinar recently. And the second looks at a kind of autologous cell therapy, and that is a collaboration with Rapid Therapeutics and is led by James Berry. And finally, the last project looks at a compound called CNMAU8, which is a kind of gold nanocrystal that could be neuroprotective. And that is a collaboration with Clean Nanomedicine. We're really excited to see these projects get off the ground and really excited for the knowledge that they can potentially provide. So as I finish up here, I just want to note that although these expanded access trials don't give us necessarily the same information as a randomized controlled trial, I do think they really offer us a unique opportunity to learn more about ALS. We're now living in a time in which ALS patients have the opportunity to be on multiple disease-modifying therapies, sometimes called stacked therapies. And expanded access trials can help us capture real-world clinical and safety data from these patients. That's important. Also, because these expanded access trials must only enroll patients that are not eligible for other clinical trials, by definition, they are capturing data from a part of the ALS population that we've been missing. This is an important puzzle piece that we have not had the opportunity to focus on before. These trials also give us the chance to try out some new methods that could be helpful for other ALS researchers. For example, one of the expanded access trials funded last year plans to enroll ALS patients by telehealth. This has the potential, if successful, to reach people with ALS that haven't been able to participate before, perhaps because they don't live close to a big research center. And finally, all of the data that are collected as part of these expanded access trials will be captured in one centralized data portal. And this information will be made freely available to researchers and to the public. And I think that has a big opportunity to impact future research. So with that, I'll close and just say thanks so much for tuning in today to hear about expanded access research trials here at the NINDS. And I do just want to reiterate, please do reach out to me or another member of our team if you have any questions. We're always happy to meet with potential applicants. And this slide has some of the contact information for our fantastic team here at the NIH.
Thank you so much. Wow, this was a fantastic presentation, so clear, really so perfect. And I hope that it's really helping many people better understand the Act for ALS and what the NIH is doing, funding all these great new approaches. So there's a few questions for you. So I will start asking them, and so I'll direct them to you, Amy, and then obviously to your colleagues as well as applicable. So a couple of questions about eligibility. So let's say that the person living with ALS is eligible for a clinical trial. Does that mean that that person will not be eligible for expanded access?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And actually, the criteria come directly from Act for ALS, as I mentioned before. So if someone is eligible to participate in a clinical trial, they would not be eligible to participate in one of these expanded access trials that are funded through this particular grant opportunity at the NIH. And as I mentioned, that's because I think the concern there is that we don't want these expanded access trials to interfere with other ongoing clinical trials, which are also very important. So thank you for that question.
Yes, and there's another question kind of going deeper into this topic. So the question is, what exactly does not eligible for a clinical trial mean? specifically, let's say that somebody is eligible only for a trial that's conducted very far away. Does that make them not eligible for the expanded access?
So that's a really good question. Actually, I wondered, Sabrina, you are doing these kinds of screenings all the time in your clinic. Would you like to say a little bit about that?
Yes, actually, this is a timely question. So it's something that I've been thinking about quite a lot recently. And so, first of all, I want to be mindful of FDA guidance and the actual Act for ALS, the legislation that guides all of this. And so the guidance is clear that expanded access should not interfere with clinical trials, because that's not in the best interest of the population. And so the participants in the expanded access should not be eligible for clinical trials. Now, until recently, most clinical trials and also most expanded access was only conducted sort of a specific sites, specific centers, where the same center would offer both a clinical trial and then expanded access. And so it was sort of, kind of contained in the same location. And so the investigator could help direct people who are eligible for clinical trials to the clinical trial and people who are not eligible for those to expanded access. Now, more recently, we're actually, and intentionally so, been expanding all these options at more remote locations. So we have really made an effort to include a more geographically diverse population, and in general, trying to be more inclusive and being able to allow participation even from people who live in remote areas. That does bring up the question of, if somebody lives in an area where there aren't clinical trials, then how do we really define accessibility? I think this is an important question. It's still ongoing. As we continue to push the envelope, thanks to the leadership of NIH, these new questions emerge. And quite frankly, it's good that we are having these new questions, because we're really starting to be able to offer options to people who live also in very remote areas. And so how does that affect sort of geographic accessibility to trials? I think it's an ongoing question. I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Sabrina, I can just add a few words. I think so initially a motivation behind the legislation was the understanding that, a fair-sized segment of the ALS population cannot participate in clinical trials based on their disease status. So with the expanded access studies, we're really hoping to give access to people living with the disease who perhaps don't fit eligibility trials, criteria of clinical trials. But I think it sort of really requires additional thought in terms of people who live in sort of more remote areas who are far away from clinical trial sites. So I think it's an ongoing discussion and conversation that we have, and in general, we just want to make these investigational agents available to those who would otherwise not have access.
And we will definitely look up to you at NIH and really follow, kind of your lead and really discuss this as a community. We need to be having these conversations. Quite frankly, the fact that we're even having this conversation now is something that would have not been possible just 3 years ago, before all of this, was put in place, because there were no options at all, zero. So now that we're having these options, we have new problems, new questions. So thank you actually to the person who asked, because we will continue to work on this. And again, in the spirit of giving people as many options as possible, considering both their location and the stage of the disease. So thank you for this. Actually, an important question about the drugs that go into expanded access. Are these drugs already approved, or are they still experimental drugs?
Yeah, so that's also a good question. I'm glad it was asked. So these drugs, as I mentioned, by definition, expanded access is a pathway that's meant to offer a way for patients to get access to something that hasn't been approved yet. So these would not be, we would not be talking about a drug or a biological compound that has already been approved by the FDA by the FDA. I hope that answers that question.
Right. Questions about the actual application process, a couple of technical questions. So when you receive applications for new expanded access, are the applications treatment specific or site specific? Also, if you can comment, I guess, on who can apply.
So
I can
I guess
address that if you want.
sure. Thanks,
Is
Emily.
that helpful? So the specific drugs and the sites that would be open, it depends on what the applicant puts forward. So the applicant is going to be proposing a number of sites that would be part of the expanded access study and part of the IND approval for that expanded access study. That will be dictated by NIH or the funding opportunity that's going to be part of the project that's proposed and then awarded. Same thing with the specific drug that is part of the expanded access program. We do know from the legislation that the drug sponsor does have to be a small business, but as long as the drug sponsor qualifies under the legislation, applicants can come in proposing an expanded access study with one or more of those eligible drugs. So there will be specific drugs and sites involved in the expanded access studies funded by this funding opportunity, but the exact drug and exact sites are not dictated by NIH there. I hope that addresses the question.
Great. And again, in terms of the applications, another sort of technical question, what is the total dollar value of grant awards available every year? And do you expect to award all dollars available?
So, so the answer to that question is that we would, of course, so the amount of funding that's available every year depends on congressional appropriations. We don't have ultimate control over that. We depend on Congress to give us the money. However, all of the money that is appropriated to us, of all the money that comes to us through Act for ALS, funding expanded access projects is our top priority. And this year, we anticipate having, as the grant funding opportunity states, about $40 million available for that. So we are hoping to get a lot of strong applications, and we would fund as many as we could from that 40 million. And for the future years, we're all waiting to see what will happen. We certainly do hope that that Congress will be generous with us so that we will have the opportunity to continue to fund this work. And just a reminder that the law will sunset in 2026. So that's sort of our short-term horizon.
So if a company applied in the past but was turned down, do you provide feedback so that they can improve their application?
Yeah, I can take that. So absolutely, that is what we do. We do that for all of our funding opportunities for all applicants who express interest, but they will get feedback from the peer review critique. It's a written document, so they get access to that. It's shared with them, and it contains a lot of details. But then we oftentimes have calls with the applicants, discuss the feedback that peer reviewers gave them. And this program is open for resubmission. So if a company applied in the past, they are certainly eligible to apply again. And it's oftentimes a very active dialogue after the application has gone through the peer review process.
Do you know how many expanded access seats or slots for patients have opened up as a result of the Act for ALS? And do you know how many of those are currently unfilled?
So that's it's a great question. I wish I had the numbers right at my fingertips. I think that so Sabrina, your study had about I think the target enrollment was 70 total.
Correct. Yeah.
And then I think the 3 projects that were funded this past year, maybe Suma can.
Amy, it's in the hundreds.
Hundreds, yeah.
Right, and it's not, so the applicants proposed a number that is feasible for them in terms of enrollment. And of course, we're looking for, you know, the higher the enrollment, the opportunity for enrollment is, the better. But on the other hand, it also needs to be feasible in terms of the production of the drug. And one of the drugs, for instance, that is currently funded is a cell product. It's quite complex to produce that cell product. So that program has a somewhat lower enrollment number. But for predopidine, for instance, it was enrollment of up to 200 individuals with the disease. And I think for the clean product, it was about 100. So it's still in the hundreds, but we are looking for new applications in fiscal year 2024. And if they do well in peer review, then, you know, there'll be an increase in open slots to participate in expanded access studies.
Yeah, and I would say that, I mean, that really these projects have been implemented as planned. I mean, the legislation was, I believe, technically signed in 2021, but I think it was December 31st, if I remember. So really at the very end. So in 2022, the first project, Trialos, was started, and targeting 70 participants, as Amelie just described. And we're almost at capacity now. We're just screening the very last few, just a handful of last few participants. So that's basically been, you know, implemented. And now in 2023, you know, we have a few hundred slots again across the different projects, and we anticipate that those studies will, you know, enroll well this year. So I think I will say that while obviously research is never fast enough, I will say that these projects have been, you know, basically implemented as planned, as scheduled.
Yeah, and one of my colleagues did the quick math. So currently there are up to 410 participants. But as I said, with the current funding opportunities, we hope to increase that number.
Can you also explain whether the dollar amount changes by year? And the comment specifically is because there's been, I believe, sometimes when the appropriation bills included $75 million per year for this, but then perhaps you mentioned $40 million. So can you clarify the exact number?
So maybe I can help address it. So in the first year, actually, of the program, the appropriation from Congress was $25 million. And in the first year, we funded a study, but we funded the entire study. And it was a 3-year study, and we funded it sort of in one single lump sum. And then last year, the appropriations were increased. They were tripled, which was really exciting for us. And we were able to fund more studies. So it was 3 expanded access studies, but we funded them on a yearly basis. And that's something that Congress asked us to do. And because of that, we have funded, of the 3 studies, we have funded year 1, but we are now up to fund year 2 in fiscal year 2024. And that is going to come out of the appropriations that we are going to receive in fiscal year 2024. And actually, we don't exactly know the amount. We hope it will be similar to last year, but certainly we now have so-called out-year costs. So of the 3 active expanded access study, we need to fund the second year because we want to make sure that these studies continue, but there's still room for new studies. So every sort of year has slightly different budgetary considerations, but we're doing the math, it's all working out, and we just hope that we'll continue getting these very, very generous appropriations.
Excellent, thank you. So there's a question about ways to sort of simplify expanded access in general. So for example, if there is a drug that doesn't require special administration, for example, a pill or something that you can take by mouth, could the sponsor mail the drug to people with ALS who live anywhere in the US, and then gather the data remotely or via a local provider?
I'm happy to take that if you want, Amy. So those are all possibilities. It's important for us to know at the NIH side that the protocols by which the drug would be administered and data would be collected would fall under that expanded access IND, which is regulated through the FDA. So the funding opportunity and the legislation do not dictate any particulars about that. That would preclude that kind of dissemination of the drug and collection of data. But it would depend on the specific protocol that is proposed and approved by the FDA and then supported by these funds.
Yes, and in fact, this is already happening. We do routinely mail drug for different studies, actually, both trials. And I know that, for example, for the predopidine EAP, we're planning on a lot of remote data collection and a lot of remote visits. So that's definitely something that that's being implemented because we understand that's something that can make the programs more flexible and more patient-centered. So we're definitely doing that. Within that, we do maintain a high rigor in terms of data acquisition and reporting so that the data acquired from the EAP can actually be used to supplement other studies that are done more traditionally. So I think we have a good combination of both, sort of, remote assessments, but also a few key in-person visits that are important for sort of the safety and as well as for some particular data gathering, such as biomarkers, for example. Great. I mean, lots of great questions, and I see lots of really great suggestions also in terms of thinking, how we can continue to push the envelope and how we can continue to meet the needs of the patient community. So I see Dr. Babu is here tonight. I don't know if you had any comments as one of the investigators working with me and others on this program.
This is such an exciting opportunity to really have that NIH and patient interface for the EAPs. I want to share the excitement that Dr. Paganoni and the NIH team has mentioned about these new programs, the expanded access protocols. These are definitely novel for the ALS field, but they're not novel in the field of medicine. And I think what's really exciting and innovative about these programs for the field of ALS is that they're not just meant for access, but we're actually running this like clinical trials, like collecting data from these studies that potentially could serve as real world evidence in the final scheme of things. So very, very exciting programs. And thank you all for all your support for these expanded access trials.
Great. And any final word from the NIH?
No, just thanks for having us. We're excited about this program. And if there are people that know potential applicants, please do reach out to us.
Thank you. And as always, we want to continue to leverage our Thursday webinars as a forum to talk about EAPs. And specifically, we're going to try to devote the second week of every month to EAP topics. And so really grateful for our colleagues from the NIH for being here tonight. We will continue to have guest speakers. And so if you have any questions, I know this is really a hot topic, a hot area of investigation, really rapidly evolving. So we're really trying to do everything we can to bring you information literally as we find out, as we learn about information. We want to be available to you. So that's why we're starting with this monthly series, again, at the regular webinar time, the second week of every month. In addition, we are continuing our other meetings, which are focused on the platform trial. So for any questions, please feel free to join this meeting, but also the other meetings, and we'll continue to take your questions about the platform trial and other trials next week and in the weeks ahead. So thank you again for joining, and we'll see you next week for the platform trial webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.